Alright, so this is a video on how to change your slide pad on a split fire two-way log splitter. Now here we got a 4490. This machine was built back in 2004, so it's 18 years old. And typically slide pads are going to last anywhere, if it's a 3000 series machine or for like semi-commercial, it's going to last about 10 to 15 years. And on the 4490 machines for heavy use, you're going to see it last 8 to 10 years, depending on how many cords you're splitting to. But if you're splitting, hundreds or into the thousands of cords a year sort of thing, you're going to see your slide pads maybe get changed every 8, maybe 7, 8, 9 years from that range. So this machine being 18 years old, it has come to the shop once before, about 7 or 8 years ago, for a slide pad change as well too. So this will be the second time we're changing the slide pads on this machine. So first thing I'm going to do, pop out this this knife. We're not going to need that. Now there's two ways you can tell you need a new slide pad kit. The first way is going to be, in this case here, the machine ejects a slide pad out. If it shoots a slide pad out the back or the front, that means the screws have either been dislodged or it's tearing a slot in the slide pad. That means this slide pad's pretty much worn out, and once it starts coming out, it's going to have to get replaced. The second way to tell is if you can grab this knife and you can move it back and forth. There is actually a dimension that we give in the owner's manual that says, hey, if you can move it back, a certain distance, it's time for a slide pad kit. So this one here is pretty snug, but it's snug because this one's getting pushed out and it's probably jammed up a little bit inside. And so obviously it's coming out. We're going to go ahead and give this one a change. So first thing in the process is get this knife all the way to the front of the machine. So we're going to go ahead, start it up. And the reason you want it at the front is because that's where you're going to be pulling it out. So let's get it over there. That way there's less pulling with a strap in the future. And now there's a little bit of play in it, but it's still pretty snug. So that's the first process. And we'll start undoing the lines, take the main pin out, and from there we're going to take the stop off, and then we can pull the whole assembly out the front of the machine. All right, so we're going to release these two hydraulic connectors. Now, sometimes they will just pop loose. If this inner fitting is turning, you're going to put a wrench on that one as well, otherwise you will wreck your hydraulic line. So in this case here, you can see that it's moving the inner fitting. That's not good, so I got to put a second wrench on the inner fitting. We're going to try to pop that loose by holding that fitting. There. Same thing over here. Whew, that was tight. There we go. And there will be a little bit of hydraulic oil that comes out of this. Not much, but always have a pail underneath it just to catch anything. Keep your shop floor nice and clean. That way you don't slip and fall on that oil if it hits the ground. So these two lines are off. Now, if you're going to pre-order a slide pad kit from us, we have lots of these caps kicking around. If you talk in your sweetest voice and ask for these, we'll throw them in for free. And what you can do is when you're got your two lines off, take your cap, put your cap on for a second just to keep the fluid from leaking out and making a bigger mess. You don't need the caps, but I don't like a huge, messy, oily sludge coming out of everything. So we'll put these caps on for a second, and all we got to do is just give them a quick snug, and there we go. That'll keep the oil in the machine where it belongs, and we'll give it a bit of a cleanup underneath here. Next step is this 7/16 bolt right here. This is just the stopper for your main cylinder pin, and that's just a 7/16 head on it, 1/4x20 bolt. Pretty simple. After the bolt's out, the job is to get this main pin out. So sometimes, or most of the time, this pin comes out pretty easily. We put a lot of anti-seize on it when we assemble the machine in the factory here. But if the machine's been sitting there for 20 years, it might come out with some difficulty. Now, in this case, I got a punch like this here. I can slide it on a bit of an angle, and you can see this one here has been out in the last 10 years, so it doesn't take an overly a lot of amount of force to get it out. But let's say, for instance, this pin doesn't want to budge. It is just solid. You can go ahead, take the 2 oil lines off of the pump and pull the motor off for a second. That way you can get a much larger punch in there directly on that pin, and you can smash it out from the side with a lot of force. In this case here, it came out really easily. I can now drop my punch, stick my vice grip sideways on the pin, something like that. Get it nice and tight, and from there we can lift the cylinder a little bit, and there you go. You can still see all the anti-seize kind of on it, and this one's been in there for maybe 7 or 8 years, so it's not stuck in this spot. Now we're on to the front of the machine. You can remove the hitch coupler first. That's a 3/4 inch socket. And there's a lot of little springs, so keep an eye on that. There you go. It sits in this orientation, the large spring, coupler, heavy short spring, washer, and nut in case it all falls apart as you're taking it apart. That's how it normally sits. So we need this to be removed so we can pull our slider out of the machine. This one here, we might put some new wiring on it after we're done. The chain hangs down just like that, so we got good clearance for that whole slider to pull right out. If it's a 3000 or 2000 series machine, it's going to have bolts at different spots, but it's all the same process. Remove all of the stop bolts off of the log stop, that way we can remove it. All right, so there we got our 1/2 inch hardware off the side plates of the stop. Now we might go ahead and throw some new hardware in, depending on how old the machine is. I mean, if the machine's older and the hardware is pretty rusted, you might want to go ahead and pick up some galvanized hardware for it. But these are all, you know, very typical size bolts. You can go to any hardware store and they're going to have this stuff in stock. So we'll definitely put new lock washers in, but we might reuse these bolts and nuts. They're still fine. Next, we'll get rid of these 6 5/8 bolts on the top here. If it's a 3000 series, they're going to be 5/8 as well, but there's going to be 4 of them, and the 2000 is going to be 1/2 inch bolts. So depending on what machine you have, it will indicate what size bolts you also have. All right, so those bolts are loose, or there's no nuts on them. You can take a hammer and you can very gently tap and get them out. You don't want to hit them too hard, of course. There's your stop bottom plate. All right, so we're going to take that out with all our nuts and lock washers. And from here, the only specialized tool you're really going to need, or that's going to help, is a big Bessie clamp like this. Hopefully you got a friend you can borrow one from, or you could purchase one as well. But what you're going to want to do here is take this Bessie clamp and clamp it right on the frame, and you're just going to put a bit of pinching pressure on it. That's going to help these bolts come out. So if they don't want to come out with a little tap of a hammer, put a little bit of pinch pressure on it. That's going to pinch that frame together. And then you can take your hammer, and with a little persuasion, these bolts will come out. There. Got one on this side. Okay, so those two are a little tight. So we're going to take the pressure off from the clamp. There we go, that made a difference. And there, that one now has got pressure released. It will come out as well. So there are the bolts that go into the top of our stop. Ready? Now you can take this clamp, tighten it up. Don't need to crank it too tight. And there comes your log stop. And that's how that comes off. We'll nicely put this on the ground over here. And then from now, a little bit of wood stuck in there. And as you release this, that frame's going to spring open. That's its natural tendency. There you go, we won't need that anymore. And if your slide pads are really worn out, you should be able to grab onto this and pull it out. This one here is still fairly snug, and so there's a couple ways you could get this out. It doesn't look very tight, but there must just be enough wood in between it and junk just to keep it snug. So you can get this out by, you know, putting this behind a small tree, taking a winch on an ATV, putting it around here, nicely slowly pulling it out. Or you could use a jackal, put a jackal between here and here, and do it that way as well. All right, so after you get your slider pulled out of the machine, you can lay it on the bed of the machine, or you can put it on a cart. Take a crowbar, pop these bad boys off. It's a really easy and painless way to do it. Just rip them off, they're going in the garbage anyways. And from there, we got to remove these screws. Now, get your pick out all the debris within the head of the screw. Sometimes they're really full and they can be packed full of debris. Sometimes they're pretty much empty. When you get them empty, you can take an impact, work the head in there, and there comes the screw. If, for instance, you can't get the impact in there, or let's say you stripped the head because it wasn't clean enough or it just didn't want to budge, go ahead, take a vice grip, put it on the head, take it, work it back and forth a little bit, and you can go ahead and turn that screw out with a vice grip. It works pretty easy either way. All right, so here we got a snap screw. Now this is 1/4 by 20, very basic tap size or bolt size. Any hardware store will have a 1/4 by 20 tap. Take the appropriate size drill bit. Now this one here is being broken off. You can see it's a little full of dirt, so we're just going to kind of drill it out a bit. Make sure we're going centered. Yep. There we go. Now you could use a regular tap holder and do it by hand. I like doing it with a drill, it's pretty quick. There we go. And then I'll go through and I'm going to re-tap every hole in this slider just to clean those threads out. That when I put my new bolts in it, I'm not going to have any problems with the bolts getting stuck, snapping off, that kind of thing. And when you're done tapping that side, go ahead, take a scraper, can be any type of scraper, come along and make sure you scrape that really good. Any kind of hard residue has to come up right down to the steel. So we got ahead and prepped this slider for the new slide pads. In your kit, you're gonna get a thick solid one, a thick one with a slot in it for the top, and 2 thin slide pads, plus all the new screws. Now you'll notice there's a bit of a shiny spot here. That is also rubbing against the inner slider. We do not need to replace that slider. This one looks to be in decent condition, and this is only going to get wear on it when these slide pads start really wearing out and the slider is able to start moving around. When the main slide pads are nice and tight, this will actually won't touch the cylinder anymore, and it'll be just fine. So this is just shiny just from it rubbing the inner slide pad, but we don't need to go ahead and change that. If we did, we would pop out the pin back here, simply pull out the cylinder. There's 2 screws in each one, they pop out, but it's rarely ever needed for those to be replaced. Now you can go ahead, take the top slide pad or whatever slide pad you wish. Start with the top one. It's a thick one. And you can go ahead and you take your screws. You will get a couple extra screws too with your kit. And these screws go nice and tight. You don't want to over tighten them, but you don't want them too loose as well. They cannot be loose, otherwise they're going to come loose during splitting and that's going to damage your frame. So get them in there nice and tight. If you over tighten them, they're simply going to snap off, which is also not what you want. But if you do snap it off, you can always drill it and tap it again. There we go. So like I said, you got 2 thicks and 2 thins. The one thick is going to go on the top of the machine with a slot cut out. That's the only place it can go. The other thick slider is going to go on the side with the hole in it for the pin. Okay, so you're going to take the second thick slide pad, and that's going to go on next. There we go. If you see some slight bubbling action, that's okay. That'll all get pressed together when you're sliding the slider back into the log splitter. And the bottom's going to take a thin. This one here I over tightened and snapped it off, so I'm going to just go ahead, take my drill bit, drill it out again. And most of the time, the drill bit will actually catch the bolt and just thread it through, and it'll just fall right through. In that case, that's what happened. So I don't even need to re-tap it. I can just take another bolt and maybe not go quite as tight. There we go. And as you're done, run your finger over them and make sure they're all the same depth. If you feel that one is out way farther than the other, then check it to make sure it's all the way tight, or maybe there's some debris in between, but it should be all the way nice and flush. And this last side here also takes a thin slide pad. Done. Now she's nice and clean, ready for that slider to go back in that frame. Back in, get an extra set of hands. Gonna lift her up.
You should be good. Up a bit.
There we go. There you go. Yeah. And so that's typically about as far as you're going to get it with new slide pads. From here, it's going to start tightening up, and we're going to use a nice come along to get her in the rest of the way. Again, you can use a couple different tools to get it in. You could use a chain binder, pretty common tool. This is a little 3/4 inch come along. You could use the winch on your ATV again, put this against a hard block and pull this way into it. Or, I don't know, you could set up a couple different ways too, but we typically use a come along. It's a pretty simple way of doing it. And in this case here, we just put the hook around this side here. And it doesn't take a lot of force. You're cranking it in. When you get close to the end, get a second set of hands to be by the cylinder, by the back of the machine there, and that person's going to guide the cylinder in between the two pucks on the end of the frame. So as I'm jacking it in on this side here, it's going to move up toward those pucks, and it has to go in between those pucks. And sometimes you get lucky and it slides right in between. And then from here, you want to make sure you only go far enough to get that hole. So the person's got to hold the cylinder up with one hand. and then they're going to let you know.
1, 2. That's about good there. One more click.
A little bit more. Whoa, right there. Perfect. And that's the lineup for that pin.
Ready?
Now this pin can go back in. Now use lots of anti-seize. If you don't have anti-seize, pick some up. You'll find plenty of uses for it around the farm. And it's just a good nickel quality anti-seize. And I mean, you can't use enough, because if you got to pull this out inevitably in 10 years again, you're going to want it to come out. So don't be afraid to give it a liberal application. Make sure she's nice and thick. There. So I got most of the pin done. From there, I'm going to grab it, and you don't want to get that stuff on your hands, because it doesn't like coming off. Okay, and you can see my pin is nicely started. Grab yourself a rubber mallet. Okay, we're up to our anti-seize line. Grab more anti-seize. Pull some off where it's kind of built up there. Okay, so that pin hit a pretty hard stop there. And we're going to want to look, and we can tell that the cylinder actually has to go up a little bit. Grab your pry bar. There we go. Our pin's in place. And from there you can wipe off the excess anti-seize. So from there, take your 7/16 bolt again. That can go back in, and that's going to hold that pin in place for another 10 years. Perfect.
Yep.
So, next step, take our lovely caps off. If you don't have caps, then you don't need to worry about the caps. I'm going to lift it up a little bit. And we're going to do it as quickly as possible. Put this one back on. And sometimes these can be a little bit of a challenge. There's no doubt about it. They take a little bit of wrestling. Good. And when you get them all the way in, you can go ahead, tighten them back up. And these don't go super tight. They're a JIC, it's a steel on steel crush fit, so they just need to go, you know, good and snug, but not killer tight. Otherwise, you will strip those if you go too crazy on them. So just a good snug. That's all they need. Now those are tight. We'll take a rag, wipe everything up, and the oily job is done.
Yep.
Now this is all complete. We maybe spilled half a cup of oil, which is very minimal. And it looks like whoever brought this machine back to us maybe overfilled the oil a little bit. So it might be a little bit high, but in any case, check your oil. If you're low on oil, give it, you know, maybe you spill a liter or half a liter, whatever. Make sure you check your oil before you start the machine. And in this case, the cylinder's in. We're going to go ahead and remove this come along here, because we're done with that as well. And then we're actually going to go ahead and start the Honda engine up on this machine. And we're going to move the knife and slider toward the engine here, just to relieve some of the stress on that, where we're going to put that back stop. first thing you do again, grab your scraper. Make sure there's no debris built up on here. That one looks pretty good. And also check this here. Take the stop, and you'll notice it just almost fits over, but not quite. So we're going to need to put that that Bessie clamp on there. There. Watch your fingers. That's looking pretty good. There's the hardware. We're going to use the existing hardware on this machine. The long ones go in the back of the stop here. Okay, we'll take a hammer, tap that down. Now we're going to go ahead here and put on some fresh lock washers. Other than that, the fasteners are going to be fine. This is the stop bottom plate, same thing again. Give it a scrape if there's any kind of build up, scrape it off as best as you can. And this here will go exactly like that. And yeah, you can see, correct, bevel's got to be up. So these need to be facing up and toward the corner of the frame. If it doesn't fit on very easily over the bolt holes, you need to go ahead, put your Bessie clamp on it and give it a bit of a pinch just to help things get aligned. But for the most part, it usually goes on pretty easily. Okay, so after you get the bolts in there and the nuts started, you can take your wrench, line up the heads nicely the way they were, and you can go ahead, and we have to actually tighten and torque the top stop bolts before we do any on the any of the stop side bolts. You can see when I'm setting the bolts, I'm putting the flats of the bolt of the head toward the flat of the stop, just to keep things fitting very nicely. After you got those bolts nice and tight with a regular ratchet, go ahead, take your torque wrench, and these here, you want to set them to 140 foot-pounds, which is nice and tight, but they need to be that for the consistent pressure that these things are seeing. So that's one. Just keep an eye on the head of that bolt. If the head of the bolt turns, you got to put a wrench on it, of course. There's an example. There we go. Those are tight. Now we can work on the stop side bolts. Now these 1/2 inch bolts can go back in. There we go. And the same thing here, we're going to put fresh lock washers on these. We can go ahead and get these nuts on these bolts here. And then we're just going to use an impact here, speed it up, just to snug them. We're not going to tighten with the impact. There we go. And then these 1/2 inch bolts, we're going to set to 100 foot-pounds. There we go. Now that the stop is fully fastened, fully torqued, we can go ahead, put our hitch coupler back on. So again, hitch coupler goes through like that. We got this big spring that sits like this, so that can go over the bolt first. And this here kind of has to go over. There's a bit of a pin, and you can see the end of that pin here that has to latch over that pin. From there it goes heavy flat washer and then the nylock nut. Now when setting the hitch coupler, you can't just tighten it willy-nilly and expect it to work. It has to be done safely. What we got here, we can take this, tighten our nylock a little ways. You can just grab your regular 2-inch ball. Must be a 2-inch ball, but this is just the hitch receiver out of our truck. Go like that, put it down on it, and this here now is not good enough. You can see there's some play in there. Yeah, so go ahead, take your impacts, check it again. So now we have no play, which is nice, and it feels a little bit loose still. It's not, you know, there should be a little bit of resistance on it. So we're gonna go maybe another 1/2 turn. Now we should be able to take this, should pop off, should latch on fairly easily, and when we move it around, there should just be, you know, a little bit of resistance, but it shouldn't be totally tight either. So I'm really happy with that there. Take a linch pin, make sure you always have it on there because that keeps things nice and safe. And so from that point right there, the machine's pretty much ready to go. So we verified the oil is good on this machine. It's still a little over full, which is fine. We'll go ahead, start it. If we grab it or hit it, this here is nice and tight. It's like probably just as tight as when it left the factory, you know, 18 years ago. So pop that pin out. So there you go. It sounds like this engine is getting a little bit tired, but we'll run it for a while. Other than that, the slider is ready to go. It'll be just as tight as new, and she'll be good for another, you know, this gentleman here used this machine a lot for an outdoor boiler, so it'll probably come back another 7 or 8 years, and then from there it'll you know, get a new slide pad kit, maybe some other repairs, but she will, you know, live to be probably 30 years old before this machine will get retired and a new one will come up. So that's pretty much all there is to a slide pad kit. You know, this is a 4000 series machine, so a little bit harder than the rest. You could typically say, with the simple tools we used here, it would take me about 1.5 hours to do, but if a person's doing it for the first time, I would say about 2.5, maybe 3 hours, something in that range. So it is a fairly simple process. There's nothing complicated about it. You know, anybody could really do this. That's how easy it is. So if you have questions about the process, or if you need a slide pad kit, give us a call at the office here, and enjoy your machine.